I'm Camille, 48 years old, and I never imagined the day I sat in the front row of my daughter's graduation would become the day she publicly humiliated me. I raised her alone, through storms, night shifts, and silence. But that day, in front of hundreds of people, she used her spotlight to push me back into the shadows. And the person who saved me wasn't family. It was a stranger with a microphone and a memory. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. I live in a quiet corner of Portland, Oregon. I'm a cleaning supervisor at a community hospital. Not glamorous, but honest. My daughter, Isabel, just graduated from college, a scholarship student, summa cum laude, full ride. She's brilliant, sharp-tongued, beautiful. And she stopped calling me mom sometime around age 16. These days, she introduces me as the woman who raised me. That day at her graduation, I still came. Front row. Press shirt. Proud heart. Isabel's father left before she was born. I was 20, cleaning apartments and saving coins for prenatal vitamins. I never asked for help. I worked 2 jobs, missed birthdays, burned dinners, and kissed scraped knees. I bought her books instead of clothes. I chose stability over popularity. But as she got older, she started to resent me. My hands weren't soft enough. My car wasn't new enough. Her classmates had moms in blazers. I had scrubs. The air in our small apartment often smelled of bleach and cheap coffee. It was the smell of my mornings, the scent I carried home from the hospital, clinging to my hair, my skin. Isabel would sometimes wrinkle her nose when I hugged her goodnight, a subtle, almost imperceptible flinch. I pretended not to notice. Her bedroom, on the other hand, was always neat, smelling faintly of lavender and the new books I bought her, novels, textbooks, even those thick, glossy art history tomes she devoured. She had a small desk by the window, often piled high with notes, highlighters, and a half-eaten apple. I'd watch her sometimes, bent over her work, the lamp casting a soft glow on her focused face, and I'd feel a profound swell of pride. That was my girl. Every sacrifice, every aching muscle, every whispered prayer in the dark, it was all for her. To give her a path I never had. A clean, smooth path, unlike the rough, patched-up road I walked. Our dinners were simple affairs. Often, just the 2 of us. A quick pasta, sometimes a frozen pizza, or if I had a rare evening off, a home-cooked meal, something hearty, like chicken and rice, the kind of comfort food that felt like a hug. I'd try to draw her out, ask about her day, her classes, her friends. She'd give clipped answers, her eyes often on her phone, or a book propped against her water glass. It was fine, Mom. Nothing much happened. The silences grew longer between us, punctuated only by the clinking of forks against plates, the distant hum of traffic outside our window. I'd tell myself it was typical teenage angst, that she was just growing up, pulling away, as all children eventually do. But a quiet ache started to settle in my chest, a cold knot of something unspoken. I remembered her as a little girl, her small hand fitting perfectly in mine, her bright chatter filling every room. Now, her presence felt like a whisper, a polite distance. There were so many small routines that defined our days, the quiet rhythm of our lives. Waking before dawn, the faint smell of my coffee brewing, the soft creak of the floorboards as I tiptoed to her room to leave a note by her bed, a reminder about a test, a packed lunch in the fridge, or just a simple I love you. I'd catch a glimpse of her still sleeping, a curtain of dark hair fanned across her pillow, and my heart would ache with a love so fierce it felt like a physical weight. Then, the rush to work, the long hours on my feet, cleaning, scrubbing, emptying bins, making beds. My hands were always rough, the skin dry and cracked from the industrial-strength cleaners. But those hands paid for her tuition, her books, her cello lessons when she was younger, the school trips, the occasional new dress for a dance. Evenings were often a blur. I'd get home exhausted and find her already immersed in her studies. Sometimes, she'd be in the kitchen, making herself a sandwich, a rare moment of independent action that still surprised me. I'd try to talk, to connect, to bridge the growing gap between us. "How was that calculus test, honey?" I'd ask, trying to sound casual, not pushy. "Fine, Mom," she'd murmur, not looking up. Or, "I think I did okay." It was never more than that. Never an outpouring, never a shared moment of triumph or frustration. It was as if she had built an invisible wall around herself, a barrier that allowed me to see her, to support her, but never truly touch her. And I, in my exhaustion and desperate hope for her success, let the wall stand. I told myself it was respect for her privacy, for her growing independence. But deep down, I knew it was something else. It was her pulling away, little by little, piece by piece, until the girl I knew so intimately was becoming a stranger, shrouded in polite indifference. Her friends, when they came over, were always cordial. They'd nod politely at me, offer a quick, "Hello, Mrs. Camille," and then disappear into Isabel's room, giggles and hushed conversations replacing the quiet of our apartment. I'd hear their music, sometimes a little too loud, but I never complained. I wanted her to have friends, to have a normal life, a social circle that extended beyond her quiet, diligent studies. I'd make them snacks, set out bowls of chips and cookies, and leave them on a tray outside her door. They'd vanish quickly, the empty bowls returned by Isabel later, often without a word of thanks, just a quiet placement on the counter. It wasn't malicious, not overtly. It was just absence. An unspoken message that my presence wasn't needed, wasn't desired. And I, desperate to give her everything, accepted that too. I accepted the quiet withdrawal, the polite distance, the subtle, constant reminder that I was the background, never the foreground, in her meticulously constructed life. One evening, I remember so clearly, I came home from a particularly long shift, my feet aching, my back screaming. I found a note on the fridge. "Dinner with friends. Don't wait up." Just 4 words, scrawled quickly on a sticky note. No "love you," no "see you later." Just a statement of fact. And a quiet, stinging realization that I had cooked her favorite meal, a slow-cooked pot roast I'd spent hours preparing on my one day off. The aroma still filled the small kitchen, a warm, comforting smell that now felt lonely and misplaced. I ate alone that night, the silence echoing around me, the pot roast tasting like ash. It wasn't the first time. There were forgotten promises to watch a movie together, plans to go to the park that were suddenly canceled for a study group, a vague mention of attending a school event with me that was then conveniently forgotten. Each incident, small on its own, was a tiny chip in the foundation of our connection. Then came the subtle shifts in her language, almost imperceptible at first. Instead of, "Mom, can you help me with this?" it became, "Can someone help me with this?" directed vaguely into the air, as if my presence was merely incidental. Or, when speaking to her friends on the phone, I'd hear her describe her upbringing in a detached, almost clinical way. My circumstances were challenging, she'd say, or I had to learn independence early on. There was a subtle rephrasing, a quiet narrative shift that positioned her as a self-made woman, pulling herself up by her bootstraps, with my role in her journey minimized to a mere backdrop, a catalyst for her own strength, rather than an active, loving participant. I started noticing her avoid eye contact when we talked about her future. When I'd ask about college applications, about scholarships, about her dreams, her gaze would drift. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was more like she was looking past me, or through me, at something I couldn't see, something bigger, brighter, that existed far beyond the confines of our small apartment and my tired life. I tried to push down the nagging feeling that she was already leaving, not just physically, but emotionally. She'd sometimes mention her professors, her mentors, the important people in her life, their names spoken with reverence and admiration. My name, when it came up, was just a name. Camille. Or, as she increasingly started to introduce me to new acquaintances, the woman who raised me. It was accurate, technically. But it lacked warmth, intimacy, the undeniable bond of a mother and daughter. It felt like a title, a designation, not a relationship. There were moments, too, when her impatience would flash, sharp and unexpected. I remember one morning, her laptop charger stopped working. I offered to take it to the electronics store on my way to work, to see if they could fix it. "Don't bother, Mom," she'd snapped, her voice tight with frustration. "You wouldn't know how to explain it anyway." The words hung in the air, a cold, blunt judgment of my capabilities, my understanding. I felt a familiar sting, a quiet humiliation. I knew I wasn't technologically savvy, but my offer had come from a place of love, a desire to help. And it was met with a dismissive wave, a clear message: you are not enough. You are not smart enough. You are not useful enough. I started finding little things around the apartment that indicated a growing separation, a desire to distance herself from our shared space. Her old childhood photos, once proudly displayed on the bookshelf, were now tucked away in a box in her closet. The faded, hand-drawn Mother's Day cards she'd made me in elementary school, once taped to the fridge, were gone, replaced by a minimalist calendar she'd bought. It was as if she was systematically erasing the tangible evidence of our shared past, replacing it with a sleek, curated vision of her future. I'd pick up a stray sock of hers, or find a forgotten hair tie on the bathroom counter, and for a fleeting moment, I'd feel a pang of connection, a reminder of the little girl who once depended on me for everything. But then she'd emerge from her room, dressed impeccably, her gaze already fixed on the world outside, and I'd know that those small, comforting anchors were no longer enough to hold her here, not really. The unease became a constant companion, a dull throb beneath the surface of my daily life. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping realization that the daughter I thought I knew, the daughter I had poured every ounce of my being into, was subtly, meticulously, building a life that had less and less room for me. It was like watching a beautiful, intricate sandcastle, built with so much love and effort, slowly being eroded by an unseen tide. I saw the signs, I felt the shifts, but I couldn't quite grasp their full meaning, their true implication. Not yet. Not until the wave finally broke. At the graduation banquet, she was the valedictorian. Spotlight, applause, cameras. She walked on stage like a star. I stood to clap. She smiled, took the mic, and said, "I owe this degree to the people who showed me who I never want to become." There was polite laughter. A few confused murmurs. My hand, still poised to clap, hesitated in the air. A cold prickle began at the back of my neck. I told myself it was nerves, stage fright, a clumsy turn of phrase. But something in her voice, a subtle edge I'd never heard before, made my stomach clench. She continued, her voice clear and resonant, amplified by the microphone, filling the large, ornate banquet hall. Every word landed with precision, aimed not at the general audience, but directly, unmistakably, at me. My upbringing taught me grit. I watched someone settle day after day, and I knew I wanted more. People laughed again. Some even clapped. A ripple of amusement spread through the tables. I saw faces turn, quick, assessing glances, then turn away. My hands froze. My heart, which had been beating with a mother's fierce pride, now began to pound with a sickening, heavy rhythm. I felt a flush creep up my neck, a hot wave of shame. I wanted to disappear, to shrink into the expensive velvet chair, to become invisible. Then came the dagger, a final, brutal thrust. Her eyes, cool and distant, seemed to find mine in the crowd for a fleeting moment, before she turned her gaze back to the sea of smiling faces. To the woman who raised me, thank you, for teaching me what giving up looks like. The words hung in the air, stark and unforgiving. A stunned silence followed, brief but deafening. Then, a smattering of applause, weaker this time, more hesitant. It wasn't roaring laughter, it wasn't an outcry. It was worse. It was the quiet, almost indifferent acceptance of her narrative. The polite agreement that yes, I had given up. The collective understanding that I, the woman in the front row, was a cautionary tale. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. I was surrounded by parents crying happy tears, their faces alight with joy and pride, their children basking in the glow of their achievements. And my daughter had just erased me in public. Not just erased me, but painted me as a failure, a negative example, a lesson in what not to be. The woman who had given her every waking moment, every spare dime, every ounce of her dwindling energy, was now a symbol of capitulation. My vision blurred. The ornate chandeliers above, the glittering centerpieces on the tables, the sea of smiling, unfamiliar faces, it all swirled into an indistinct haze. I felt a desperate, primal urge to lash out, to stand up, to scream, "No. You don't understand." But my throat was tight, constricted, as if a hand had reached inside and squeezed the life out of me. My limbs felt heavy leaden. I was trapped in my own body, a prisoner of her words. I looked around for anyone who might understand, anyone who might offer a flicker of recognition, a shred of empathy. No one met my eyes. The people at my table politely averted their gaze, suddenly engrossed in their programs or their champagne flutes. Even the staff passing by, their trays laden with hors d'oeuvres, seemed to glide past me, their expressions blank, unseeing. No one said a word. The silence that followed her speech was not a sympathetic one. It was a void, a chasm that swallowed me whole. I tried to steady myself, to breathe, to not let the tears fall, not here, not now, not in front of all these strangers, not in front of her. But they came. Quiet, invisible ones, tracking hot paths down my cheeks. They weren't loud, theatrical sobs. They were silent, desperate tears. The kind only a mother cries when her child weaponizes her pain, when the deepest love she possesses is twisted into an instrument of public shame. It was a grief so profound it felt physical, like a shard of ice embedded in my chest, slowly, painfully melting. The world had shifted on its axis, and I was left adrift, unanchored, in a sea of my own silent despair. The bright, hopeful future I had envisioned for her, for us, had just been shattered, not by an external force, but by the very person I had built it for. And in that moment, sitting alone in the midst of a celebration, I felt a desolation so absolute, it was as if my entire existence had been rendered meaningless. My life, my sacrifices, my very being had been reduced to a bitter punchline. Then someone cleared his throat into the microphone. A sharp, distinct sound that cut through the polite murmurs that had begun to fill the room. The dean, Dr. Alastair Finch. A graying man with quiet eyes and a soft voice, usually reserved for academic pronouncements and introductions. He stepped forward, taking the microphone from Isabel, who seemed momentarily surprised, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. The dean didn't look at her. His gaze swept over the audience, a calm, steady assessment, and then his eyes settled on me. "Before we conclude this evening's ceremony," he began, his voice surprisingly strong, carrying effortlessly through the hall, "I'd like to say something about the woman in the front row." Every head in the room swiveled. The murmuring died down completely. A hush fell, heavy with anticipation. All eyes, now, were on me. I felt a sudden jolt, a mixture of terror and a strange, unfamiliar hope. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. Isabel, still on stage, stiffened beside the dean, her earlier confidence seemingly drained from her. She looked as if she wanted to disappear, much like I had moments before. The dean continued, his voice even, yet imbued with a quiet authority. He wasn't speaking in grand pronouncements. He was simply stating facts, observations. And each word felt like a bomb on my raw, exposed soul. "I saw her every week," he said, his gaze still fixed gently on me, a profound acknowledgement in his eyes. "For the past 4 years, I saw her coming to clean the faculty lounge before her shift. She worked late nights, often until past midnight, and then she'd be back before dawn for early shifts." A murmur rippled through the audience. Faces that had been indifferent now held expressions of dawning understanding, even surprise. They hadn't known. They hadn't seen. "I didn't know her name then," the dean continued, his voice softening slightly, "but she always brought her daughter's textbooks in her bag. Not her own, mind you. Her daughter's. And I often saw notes tucked between the pages, little scribbles on paper towels, on napkins. She was teaching herself what her daughter was learning, just to keep up." The room fell silent again, a different kind of silence this time. Not the void of indifference, but a heavy, contemplative quiet. I felt a fresh wave of tears prick my eyes, but these were different. These were tears of recognition, of validation. Someone had seen. Someone had noticed. The countless hours I spent hunched over those heavy books after a grueling shift, trying to decipher complex equations, to understand historical contexts, just so I could talk to her about her studies, just so I could help her with her homework, even though my own education had ended abruptly years ago. He had seen it. I never met a parent more determined, the dean said, his voice now imbued with a quiet reverence, or more invisible. Until now. And with those last 3 words, he looked directly at Isabel, a clear, unmistakable message in his eyes. The room was utterly still. You could have heard a pin drop. Isabel looked stunned. Her face, which had been so composed and triumphant moments before, was now pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and, perhaps, something akin to dawning comprehension. The bravado, the carefully constructed persona of the self-made woman, had crumbled. Some people in the audience began to clap, softly at first, then growing louder, a slow wave of genuine applause spreading through the room. Others simply stared at Isabel, their expressions no longer amused, but filled with a quiet judgment. She looked down, her gaze fixed on the podium, her shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. For the first time, she looked small. Not just physically small, but diminished. The spotlight that had been hers moments ago now felt like an interrogation lamp, exposing her words, her choices, her carefully crafted narrative. I didn't say a word. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. There was nothing to add. The truth in the dean's quiet, steady voice had spoken for itself. The room already saw it. They saw me. Not as a symbol of failure, but as something else. Something resilient. Something strong. I felt a quiet shift within me. A loosening of the tight, suffocating knot in my chest. The searing pain, though still present, was now accompanied by a surprising sense of lightness, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. It wasn't a triumphant feeling, not a vengeful one. It was something far more profound, the quiet satisfaction of being seen, truly seen, after so long existing in the shadows. The sting of her words was still there, a dull ache, but it no longer consumed me. It was as if the dean's simple, honest words had created a shield, deflecting the final, most hurtful blow. I didn't wait for hugs or photos. The thought of lingering, of facing Isabel, of navigating the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, felt too overwhelming. I just wanted to be somewhere quiet, to process what had happened, to breathe freely. So, as the applause began to fade and the murmurs resumed, I quietly slipped out of my seat, moving through the periphery of the banquet hall, my steps light, almost buoyant. I didn't look back. I walked out into the cool evening air, the buzz of the city a welcome contrast to the stifling silence of the hall. The sky was streaked with the last vestiges of twilight, a soft purple bleeding into a deeper blue. I took a deep, shaky breath, the crisp air filling my lungs, a refreshing antidote to the heavy, stagnant air of the past hour. A sense of quiet liberation began to unfurl within me, a gentle unfolding, like a flower after a long drought. I heard footsteps behind me, quick and light. I paused, half expecting to hear Isabel's voice, a belated apology, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm. But it wasn't her. A young woman, a student perhaps, with bright, earnest eyes and a kind smile, ran to catch up to me. She was wearing a simple black dress, and her graduation cap was clutched in her hand. She looked slightly out of breath. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft, almost shy. Are you Isabel's mom?" I nodded, a small, uncertain smile touching my lips. My heart, which had just begun to settle, gave another small flutter. She hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer. "I just wanted to say, what the dean said, your story, it really resonated with me." Her eyes were wide, sincere. It made me want to call my mom. Right now. Just to tell her, thank you. And in that moment, standing under the fading light, with a stranger's kind words echoing in my ears, a true, genuine smile finally bloomed on my face. It wasn't a forced smile or a polite one. It was a smile born of deep relief, of a quiet, profound joy. Because in the end, I didn't need Isabel's approval. I didn't need her public validation. The sting of her betrayal might always be a faint scar, a reminder of the raw vulnerability of a mother's love. But it didn't define me. It didn't diminish the truth of my efforts, my sacrifices, my unwavering love. The dean had seen it. This young woman had seen it. And more importantly, in that moment, I finally saw it myself. I just needed someone to finally see me. And someone did. The days that followed were surprisingly quiet. There was no phone call from Isabel, no text message. It was as if the public revelation had solidified the chasm between us, making it too wide to cross, at least for now. A part of me, the deeply wounded part, still hoped for an apology, a sign of regret, a flicker of the little girl who once adored me. But another, stronger part, the one that had begun to emerge in the quiet aftermath of the dean's words, knew that her silence was, in its own way, a confirmation. It confirmed that her narrative of self-reliance, of pulling herself up without significant aid, was deeply entrenched, perhaps too deeply to ever acknowledge the truth. I went back to work the next day, the hospital hallways feeling strangely familiar, almost comforting. The mundane tasks of cleaning, the methodical rhythm of my movements, provided a soothing balm to the emotional turbulence of the graduation night. I scrubbed, I polished, I emptied bins, my hands working automatically, while my mind processed, slowly, deliberately, the new landscape of my life. I realized that for so long, my identity had been inextricably linked to Isabel's success, to her future. Her achievements were my achievements. Her dreams, my dreams. And in her public rejection, I had felt as though my entire being had been negated. But now, with the sting of that moment still fresh, there was also a budding awareness of myself as a separate entity. Camille. Not just Isabel's mother, but Camille, a woman who worked hard, who loved fiercely, who had endured, and who, despite everything, was still standing. The routine became a kind of meditation. The scent of antiseptic, the gentle whir of the floor buffer, the quiet murmur of nurses' voices in the distance, these were the sounds of my reality, a reality I had built with my own hands. I started to notice small details I had previously overlooked. The way the morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The faint, sweet smell of the flowers in the patient waiting area. The quiet gratitude in the eyes of an elderly patient when I adjusted their blanket. These were small moments, but they were my moments, untainted by the complex, often painful, dynamic with my daughter. I began to reclaim pieces of myself that had been dormant for years. I remembered how much I loved reading, not just Isabel's textbooks, but stories, narratives that transported me to other worlds. I started visiting the local library after work, losing myself in novels, in biographies, in histories. I even picked up a book on gardening, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time or energy for. My small apartment had a tiny balcony, and I envisioned it filled with pots of vibrant green, small bursts of life. The young woman from the graduation, the one who had approached me, sent me an email a few days later. Her name was Sarah. She thanked me again, telling me she had indeed called her mother, and it had been a long, meaningful conversation. She also told me she was working on a research project about resilience and single mothers, and asked if I would be willing to be interviewed, anonymously, of course. I hesitated for a moment. The thought of reliving the painful details, even in private, felt daunting. But then I thought of her earnest eyes, her simple act of kindness, and I agreed. The interview with Sarah was cathartic. I spoke about the early struggles, the exhaustion, the hope, the gradual emotional distance, and finally, the public humiliation. It was the first time I had articulated the full scope of my experience, not just to myself, but to another person who truly listened, without judgment. Sarah nodded, asked thoughtful questions, and sometimes, her own eyes would well up with tears. In telling my story, I found a new clarity. I realized that my love for Isabel, though tested, was not diminished, but transformed. It was a love that no longer sought external validation, but existed, simply, as a profound truth within me. I also started to connect with colleagues at work in a deeper way. I had always been friendly, but often guarded, my focus solely on my tasks and getting home to Isabel. Now, I lingered a bit longer during breaks, shared a laugh over a cup of coffee. I learned about their lives, their families, their struggles and joys. I found a quiet camaraderie, a sense of belonging in a community that had always been there, but which I had largely ignored in my singular pursuit of Isabel's success. I even joined a small, informal book club with a few of the nurses. We met once a month, discussing stories, sharing perspectives, and in those evenings, I felt the lightness I hadn't known in years. The process of healing wasn't linear. There were still moments, often in the quiet of the night, when the words Isabel had spoken would echo in my mind, a sharp, unwelcome reminder of the pain. I'd lie awake, tears pricking my eyes, reliving the shame, the disbelief. But these moments became less frequent, less intense. They were like passing clouds, briefly obscuring the sun, but never completely blocking its light. I learned to acknowledge the pain, to sit with it for a moment, and then to gently, firmly, guide my thoughts away. Towards the small, green shoots emerging on my balcony. Towards the characters in my latest novel. Towards the laughter shared with a new friend. I found a quiet strength in accepting that I could not control Isabel's perception of me, nor could I force her to see my sacrifices. Her journey was hers, and mine was mine. My rising was not about her downfall or about proving her wrong. It was about reclaiming my own peace, my own dignity, my own sense of self-worth. It was about tending to the garden of my own life, carefully replanting seeds of joy and purpose, nurturing them with gentle hands. I haven't heard from Isabel directly since that day. No apology, no explanation. But I did receive an indirect message, a small, almost imperceptible ripple in the pond. Sarah, the student, contacted me again a few months later. She had interviewed several other mothers, and her research project had garnered significant attention. She told me it was being presented at a major academic conference, and that her professor, Dean Finch, was particularly proud of her work. She mentioned that he had specifically emphasized the importance of acknowledging the unseen labor and sacrifices of parents, especially single mothers. She also said, somewhat hesitantly, that Isabel had apparently reached out to Dean Finch, not long after the graduation, to discuss something related to a postgraduate opportunity. Sarah wasn't privy to the details, but she said she overheard the dean mention something about perspective and understanding the full picture. It was vague, an echo more than a direct communication, but it was enough. It was enough to know that the truth, quietly spoken, had found its way. It was enough to know that the seed of a different narrative had been planted. I don't know if Isabel ever truly understood the depth of her words or the pain they inflicted. Perhaps she never will. Perhaps she will carry her own version of the truth, her own narrative of her rise, forever. And I, for the first time, am okay with that. I am Camille, 48 years old. I am a cleaning supervisor. I am a reader, a budding gardener, and a friend. I am a woman who raised a brilliant daughter and who, in the face of profound betrayal, found her own quiet, resilient strength. The scars are there, faint lines on my soul, but they are no longer bleeding. They are part of my story, a testament to what I have endured and what I have become. I am free. Not free from pain, not free from memory, but free from the need for external validation. Free from the constant yearning for a daughter's elusive approval. The girl I raised is out there, making her way in the world on her own terms. And I, the woman who raised her, am here, making my way on mine. I am not the same person I was before. The naive, self-sacrificing mother who defined herself solely by her child's success is gone. In her place stands a woman who knows her worth, independent of anyone else's perception. I don't forgive the act of betrayal, not in the sense of erasing it or pretending it didn't happen. But I also don't hold on to the bitterness, the corrosive resentment that would only poison my own heart. I have found my way back from betrayal, not by confronting it, but by quietly, steadfastly, rebuilding my own world. Have you found your way back from betrayal?